people talk about ultra processing. I mean, food doesn't require some magical ability to make you fat just because it went through a factory. It's something has changed about it. What has changed about it? I argue it's the sensory qualities. It's the way it smells and tastes. That's what we have changed.
Where do cravings come from? Like, why do we have this unrelenting craving for modern foods?
Well, unrelenting is something that's new, but craving, the origin of craving, it's there for a very good reason, because it serves some purpose in our evolutionary past. For the mind to become gripped with the idea of getting a certain thing clearly must have been important. It served us well in the past. We see all sorts of examples in the animal world where you can make, they do it in animal science laboratories. They'll make animals deficient in a needed nutrient, and they seek out foods that give them the nutrient that they require. They crave them. We know this from our own history that when British sailors had scurvy, they craved fruits and vegetables. There was an inner voice telling them what they needed. So the root of this is good. The root of this comes from something in our own nature that's there for a good reason. Obviously, in the present context, it's not good. And that, I think, is what makes this such an interesting but also beguiling riddle to solve.
Well, I feel like you probably have many, many tools for how to get rid of food cravings. But what are the qualities that make a food craveable? I guess let's start there.
Well, so I mentioned this, and I think it changes. I mentioned that situation of scurvy. I don't think a whole lot of us are in that situation today, but it was something inside their body that delivered a signal to their brain that said, we need to get this. So it comes from what scientists would call the internal milieu, something going on inside the body. What makes something craveable in the present food environment, I would say, is calories. We crave calories. Now, a lot of people say that is the condition we are born with as we come out of the womb, because calories were scarce when we were, in our evolutionary past. I don't think that's true, but that's what we see. And I think it's an important distinction, because a lot of scientists will also say that we live in a hyper-palatable food environment, as though we are surrounded by just incredibly delicious food. I don't think that's true. I mean, there's definitely a quality that junk food has. When you put it in your mouth, you want to keep eating it. But I don't think, if we think of things like Big Macs or Doritos or Fanta, nobody would ever say these foods, have some golden memory of like, I had a bag of chips on a Tuesday in 1998. I can still remember it. Like, that doesn't happen. We eat these foods and we have a compulsion to eat them, but I certainly don't think they are anywhere close to the high point of pleasure. And I think that's important, because I think pleasure is something that's misunderstood. And I think that's actually the way we can get out of this problem.
Yeah, but don't we crave food for the mouth pleasure? I mean, it's not like when I see a delicious appearing slice of pizza, or when I crack open a pint of ice cream or undo a bag of Doritos, that I'm thinking, oh my God, I can't wait to get these calories in my mouth. Like, we don't have calorie sensors on our tongues. So how do we reconcile that?
Well, we sort of do have a calorie sensor on our tongue. The sweet sense is ultimately a way of sensing sugar, carbohydrate, calories. But I agree with you. When we look at pizza, we're not thinking consciously calories. But that, I think, is what the brain is craving. As far as what is the in-mouth experience, this is really interesting, because I wrote a book called The Dorito Effect. And I'll be the first to say Doritos taste different than tortilla chips, right? But the thing I also find interesting about a lot of junk food is it's never truly gratifying, in the sense that if I finish that bag of Doritos, I don't feel truly sated and healthful and happy and contented after. I kind of feel a bit weird, like a little bit of regret. And it's just not a food that sits with you well. I think food that is truly nourishing is delicious in the moment. There's that excitement to eat it. But then when you want to eat it, it's more than just this desire to keep eating. It can actually kind of slow things down, and it's a more immersive pleasure. And then there's that stage afterwards where there's a kind of a contentedness. You think like, that tasted great and I feel great. And that's how food should make you feel. And I think an awful lot of food we eat today doesn't make you feel anything like that. It's just about that I got to keep eating thing.
Yeah, it's so true. So we do have, I guess, there are certain nutrient sensors that I guess we have. Some have argued that protein is the primary nutrient. That's I believe it's the protein leverage hypothesis, right? That stipulates that our need for amino acids, essential amino acids, really drive much of this craving. Others would say, well, it's minerals and micronutrients and things like that. Where in your research, what would you say is are some of the major leverage points in terms of satiating our hunger without this drive, this necessity to overconsume calories?
Well, I think good food, real food that comes from nature, comes from land, comes from the sea, is by its nature satiating. If you eat good food that is real, I mean, it sounds simple, but a lot of people don't eat food like that. I think it is satiating on its own. You can try and pin it down to protein, this or that. It's actually hard to truly pin down, because the truth is all our diets are kind of an up and down roller coaster. We tend to eat more at dinner than we do at breakfast. If you look at people's day-to-day calorie logs, some days people will eat 3,500 calories. Some days people eat 1,700. And it's a lot of it's unconscious, but the brain does a really good job of balancing these things. I think what is so interesting to answer this question of what's going on is one of the first things we have to do is understand how intelligent the human brain is when it comes to eating. And I think this is where things go wrong. So I'll give you an example of just how powerful the brain is. One thing that tells us how powerful the brain is the fact that diets don't work, but they don't work in a very interesting way. The truth is all diets do work, but they only work for about 6 months. At that point, weight loss sort of plateaus, and then the weight starts to come back. And the dieters, they swear the scale must be lying. They swear they're trying hard, but the weight comes back. Most people think it's because they failed. The diet was working, I failed. What we know to be the case is that the brain intervenes and says, I want you to gain back the weight that you lost. So the brain has in mind what scientists call a set point. It kind of wants you to weigh a certain amount. I weigh about 171 pounds, and that's just sort of what I weigh. I might creep up a couple pounds, go down, but that's what I weigh. Now, this whole idea that the stomach is this unfillable pit and that we are just on this lifelong quest to just get fat, that's contradicted by the fact that when scientists do overfeeding studies, this is the opposite of going on a diet. This is just eating too much. Those also fail spectacularly. The first overfeeding study was so difficult to do. It was so hard to actually get people to subject themselves to the absolute misery of eating too much food. They had to do it in a prison. Now, it seemed that when they were getting these prisoners fat, that they required more calories than seemed necessary to get them fat. And then when that study ended, they came right back to their set point. So you lose weight, you come back to your set point. You gain weight, you come back to your set point. So the brain exerts far more control over our body weight. So this idea that we have that we can go on a diet and I can count calories, I'll look in the back of the package, it's just a total myth. This is being controlled by your brain. So the central point of this book, well, one of them that I want to make is that we have to understand how the brain understands food. This whole idea that we can consciously talk about protein and carbs and calories and exert what they say is executive function it's an absolute fantasy. It's not how it works. But the brain, I argue, has an intelligence that we don't even understand. And if we can start to crack that intelligence, I think we'll come close to solving this great problem.
Yeah, fascinating. So let's unpack that. First of all, the weight set point. I mean, is that where within the brain does that lie? And at what point does it get set? I mean, does it get set when we are perhaps in our most fit adolescent stage, or where does that number exist within the brain?
If I look in your ear, no, it's a great question. And we don't know completely. It's probably something to do with the hypothalamus, which is the part of the brain that regulates things like breathing and heart rate. It's what they call the homeostatic stuff, just keeping yourself alive. We do know, for example, that fat gives off a hormone. And this is one way your brain knows of how much fat there is by how much of this hormone it is. They found that there's sensors. There seems to be sensors in the bones of rodents that give the brain some information as to how much it weighs. And we think the same is true of humans. We know that.
What is this hormone?
I'm going to forget the name because I'm doing a podcast. It's not ghrelin. It's the other one. It's that massive one.
Leptin.
Leptin. Thank you. That's how my brain's working today. So we know that there's all sorts of signals the brain gets. How does it work? It's something they're still piecing together. But we know, for example, when females, when they get their period, it's based not so much on age, but how much they weigh, which is why it's happening at earlier ages, because young girls weigh more because we're all gaining weight. So that's telling us the brain has some idea what it weighs. Here's one of the really interesting things too, because I talked earlier about pleasure. one of the really interesting things when we look at brain scans of people with obesity, everybody thinks that the difference they're going to see comes down to pleasure. So if they take you're trim versus a brain of someone with obesity, let's say it comes down to drinking a milkshake. They think the difference is going to come in that sip of the milkshake, that your brain's going to go like, yeah, that was pretty good. And their brains go like, oh my God, that was incredible. And that's in fact not what we see. What we tend to find is the people with the trim body type actually enjoy it more. The enjoyment is blunted in people with obesity, which is not what most people think. So where do you see the difference? You see it on the anticipation. When they see the picture of that milkshake, they get this huge spike in what's called dopamine wanting. They crave it. So when you say what changes the set point, this is what I think we're seeing is that the change that we see in our brains and resulting in a change in our bodies is that we want to eat food too much. Something that's making us want to consume too many calories. And I think that is the golden question. So when we say things like we're getting fat because we're eating too many calories, like, yeah, that's true on a physiological basis. That's true. Too many calories going in. But the deeper question is why? What is making us want to eat all those calories?
This is fat. So people who are overweight, they have a blunted pleasure response to food. But is their pleasure response heightened when observing food, or was that the leaner people?
No, that's the leaner people. Yes, it was so let's break it down. When we talk about pleasure, let's talk about the history of it. You've heard of the neurotransmitter dopamine, right? Mm-hmm. It's a neurotransmitter. It's sort of like one people have heard of serotonin. For a long time, people thought dopamine was the pleasure neurotransmitter. It was like just liquid euphoria. You pour a bottle of this in your brain and you just couldn't be happier. Life is just incredible. So I talked about the work of a psychologist named Kent Berridge, who set out to show he was a dopamine believer and he wanted to just add evidence to the dopamine hypothesis. So what he did is he used drugs to tamp down the amount of dopamine in some rats' brains. And he fired a little shot of sugar water to their mouth. And he's thinking with dopamine, down, they're just not going to enjoy the sugar water. But they start to lick their paws and stick their tongue out, which is a rat's way of saying ooh, I really like that. So Kent's going, what the heck's going on? He's sure he screwed it up. He does it again. It happens again. So now he brings out the heavy artillery. He's like, what is going on? He lesions their brain. So this dopamine pleasure network is just gone. It's obliterated. They're in this beige, horrible, catatonic world of not even able to move. They just live in this pleasureless void, it seems. He fires the sugar water in their mouth. And there they go, licking their paws and sticking their tongue up gleefully. What is going on? Well, now he reverses tactics. He says, I'm going to crank up dopamine. He sticks electrical electrodes into their brain, cranks up this dopamine network. And now the rats are gorging like crazy. This is looking like dopamine's pleasure. Not quite, because they're making these facial expressions like, yuck, this is disgusting. I can't stand this. So the pleasure picture is looking more confusing than ever. More evidence starts to come in from other avenues of science. Dopamine is also involved in movement. Parkinson's disease is an underproduction of dopamine. So one way to treat people with Parkinson's is to give them drugs that elevate dopamine. Well, they find that these patients start to do the strangest things. One of them just decides he's going to dismantle his fridge and put it back together. Another just starts chopping wood crazily. They seem to really enjoy gambling. They like slot machines. They like scratch cards. They pester their wives for sex. They binge watch pornography. They visit prostitutes. And all the while they say, I didn't enjoy any of it. I just felt compelled to do it. Finally, Kent Berridge solves the pleasure riddle. And he finds that what we think of as pleasure is in fact two different neural circuits. There's the motivation circuit. This is the one that runs on dopamine. This is go. This is action. This is desire at its most visceral elemental state. This is craving. This is that experience you have when you're hungry and you smell the pizza and you think, I really, really want to eat that. I'm starving. There is another pleasure network that comes into action when you put that piece of pizza in your mouth and you say, oh my goodness, that's delicious. That is called liking. That operates on opioid neurotransmitters. These are two different networks. They're related. They talk to each other. You can experience them both at the same time because you can put that piece in your mouth and go, that's delicious, and I want to have another bite, but they are distinct. So it's important that when we talk about pleasure, that we talk about the difference between wanting something and liking something. And it can be really slippery because very often when you want something, you think you like it. So addicts that are in the throes of an addiction to, let's say, heroin or alcohol, they are absolutely convinced when they're the depth of craving that this will solve all their problems. Nothing could make them feel better. And then when they actually receive the heroin or the alcohol, they realize again that it sold them an empty promise. Pleasure, for a true addict, pleasure left the station ages ago. It's really a disease of craving. And that's what we see with people with binge eating disorder and people with obesity. It's defined by craving. So we know with heroin or with alcohol, we know it's disrupting this, what's hijacking this network are drugs that interact with the brain in a way that, evolution didn't really think about. With eating, it becomes something much different because we were meant to eat food. We were meant to eat calories, carbs, and fat. What is going on that could make the brain go in this hyper state of wanting? That, I think, is the real question.
So is it purely an issue of caloric density, which we know are one of the defining features of modern ultra processed foods, or is it taste? Is it a combination of both? Because if it were purely about our desire for calories, you'd see people walking around in the streets drinking oil, right? Or eating sticks of butter, right? The most calorie dense foods that there are. Just
putting sugar in their mouth. A lot of people will say that. And I think on the surface, it looks that way because you see a lot of people with obesity. Of course, they're consuming a lot of calories. So we blame highly caloric foods and they say they're the culprit. But I spent a lot of time in northern Italy in this book. I spent a lot of time in a city called Bologna. That's where we get the word bologna or bologna from, that luncheon meat that doesn't have such a golden reputation here. Over there, they call it mortadella. And that is a deli meat they absolutely revere. You can see it's got little cubes of white fat. They're not afraid of fat in northern Italy. They do not eat a Mediterranean diet, by the way. Nothing could be further from the truth. Go to southern Italy, they eat a Mediterranean diet or something more along the lines of a Mediterranean diet. They actually have more obesity in southern Italy. That's something we can talk about later. In Bologna, they love fat. They love food. They love food to the point that you'd think that, are these people all food addicts? Because in their Chamber of Commerce, they have a repository of recipes, which is to say, if you're going to make lasagna or tortellini or any number of these recipes they revere, they have rules. They say you have to make it this way. They love pasta so much. Their favorite noodle is called a tagliatelle noodle, and they have one cast in gold. It's like the Platonic perfect noodle. These people love carbs. They love fat. Well, if nutrient density and deliciousness and caloric density was really the problem, you would expect that Northern Italians would be the plumpest in the world. It is going to blow your mind. Their rate of obesity is less than 8%. We're 42% here, less than 8% there. They have a diet that everybody in the world wants to experience. People fly by the plane load. Bologna is a culinary epicenter of Italy, one of the most famous eating cities in the world. The food is incredible and they're thin. It's really good news, actually, because it tells us you can actually have a great relationship with food and not be fat. But it also tells me that our superficial understanding of calories are the problem isn't quite getting at it. Something deeper is going on.
It's so interesting. And you're right. Like the food, I'm sure the food, and by the way, you have a really tough job doing research on getting to live in such exotic parts of the world. But there is a difference, right? Like, the food of Northern Italy, I'm sure is amazing, but there's a lot of spices used. There's like the palate, the flavor complexity of extra virgin olive oil they use a lot. There's like the red wine. It's a little bit different than the hyper palatable, like the kinds of flavors that you get in a Mars bar or a Twinkie. The kinds of it's the flavor, the breed of deliciousness that a 10-year-old would find to be just like the greatest thing on earth. You know what I'm saying? It's like it delights even the most developed tongue. So to me, I feel like there's something about it that speaks to like the reptile brain, right? Like the hypothalamus, because the flavors are just so like in your face and so not an acquired taste. Is there any truth to that? Would you say that that's true?
I think there is some degree to which that is true. And I think what's so interesting with the foods that you mentioned is they don't have their own flavor. they have been created to have a flavor that was decided by a flavorist who works in a lab, who came up with that flavor. The interesting thing about Italian cuisine is its focus on natural ingredients, not just like this kind of hippie organic sense of natural, but they revere different regions. I went to a small town that has a bean festival because they say, like, we grow the best beans in the world. Like, no one's beans can touch ours. Nature expresses flavor very differently than fast food companies and food conglomerates, where the flavor is literally designed in a lab. The other interesting thing is flavor changes in nature. No two apples taste identical, but all confected foods taste identical. That is how they're designed to be. The interesting question is, what does all this flavor manipulation do? And how could that affect the brain? Because let's say it is possible that you can stick flavorings in, like, look at Coca-Cola or Pepsi or any soft drink. That's just sugary soda water, right? And they put flavoring in it. And I would argue the flavoring is what makes you drink it. We wouldn't drink sugary soda water, I don't think, unless you're really thirsty or something. You're not going to look forward to that. But theoretically, we should be able to handle what they call like a preload. Like if you take people and you give them calories before their dinner, they tend to eat a smaller dinner because it makes you a little bit more full. So the question, having written a book called The Dorito Effect, was, how does all this monkeying around ultimately affect the brain? Because if we look, why does food taste the way it does? It's got to be for a really important reason. We tend to think taste has nothing to do with nutrition. We say things like, if it tastes good, spit it out. We think that this experience of enjoying food needs to be repressed, and that we need to use the kind of the hard science of nutrition to guide our behavior. But if you look at the sense of taste, if you ask this question, what lights up more gray matter than anything else, more than having sex, more than reading Shakespeare or doing differential calculus? It's eating food. It just lights up your brain like nothing else. If you look at your genome, the thickest chapter is not on the chapter on making your brain or your eyeballs or your gonads. It's making your nose and mouth. This is your food sensing equipment. So that stuff is there to sense nutrients. It's obviously really important. And what I find so interesting about our food discussion is we've spent 50 years yelling about nutrients, about fat, about carbs. We haven't changed fat or carbs. They're the same as they've always been. A fat molecule is still a fat molecule. What we've changed is the flavor of food. People talk about ultra processing. I mean, food doesn't require some magical ability to make you fat just because it went through a factory. It's something has changed about it. What has changed about it? I argue it's the sensory qualities. It's the way it smells and tastes. That's what we have changed. That's what changes when we process food. I talk about an experiment in the book, which I think is really important in showing how essential the faculty of taste is when it comes. I'll tell you two, in fact. One of them, this is interesting. It's a sad story of a little boy. His name was Tom. This is over 100 years ago. When he was 9 years old, I still can't figure out how this could have happened, but he consumed clam chowder that was so hot, it sealed his esophagus shut. So, wow. I mean, like, how does clam chowder get that hot? I don't know. They didn't have microwaves back then. I don't know how that happened. But this is what happened. It's a sad story. So you'd say from that point forward, there's absolutely no point in him putting food in his mouth because he can't swallow it. It's useless. It's pointless, right? So he's doing very badly. He's obviously not thriving. He's getting emaciated. He's losing weight. Doctors created what they call a fistula, a hole in his stomach where he could just literally load in food the way you load in boxes in the trunk of your car. Just load it in. They start to put food in his stomach. He's still doing terribly. They can't figure out what's going on. And one day this little boy just kind of squeaks out, "Let me taste it first." So they let him taste his food first. And all of a sudden he starts to thrive. That saved his life. And from that point forward, he would always chew and taste his food first and then spit it into a tube that was connected to his stomach. And he said if he didn't do that, it was like the food just went right through him. So this is telling us that experience of tasting food isn't frivolous and disconnected from nutrition. It's essential to how the body processes, how it metabolizes food. There's a modern experiment that reinforces this and gives us great detail as to exactly how important this is. I talk about the work of a scientist named Dana Small. She's a neuroscientist at Yale. And she asked what she thought was a simple question, which was, can we take beverages and make them just as rewarding, but let them have fewer calories? And if it turns out your brain is stupid, this could be a really good idea, right? Just give that brain, give it what it wants, but kind of secretly, like, I'm going to, pull away those calories. So how do you test this? It's a tricky question. And this is what makes Dana Small such an interesting scientist, is she came up with this really neat method. She created 5 drinks. They all have their own unique flavor and color, but she uses an artificial sweetener called sucralose. So they all taste as though they have 75 calories worth of sugar. She then uses a tasteless starch called maltodextrin so that she can alter the calorie payload of each drink. So one drink has 0, one has 37, one has 75, one has 128, and one has 150 calories. 5 drinks, equally sweet, all have different calories. She gives these to her subjects so they can drink these drinks and their brain can learn, form a relationship with these drinks, analyze the drinks. And what Dana Small predicts is that the 150 calorie drink is going to get the biggest brain response because humans like calories, right? For some reason, she puts her subjects in the brain scanner. It's the 75 calorie drink that just goes ding, 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 ding. And she's like, why would that be? Light can't bear it. She's like, I must have screwed it up. I'm going to do it again. It happens again. Then she takes these subjects and she puts them on what's called an indirect calorimeter. This measures what's called the thermic effect of food. So when you consume food, those calories and protein, whatever, goes into your stomach, your body has to start processing it. That generates heat. We can measure that heat, and the more calories you consume, the bigger the thermic effect. So one day, a female subject comes in and she drinks that 75 calorie drink. Nice little plume of heat. This is what you'd expect. All things, operating fine. A few days later, she comes in and drinks the 150 calorie drink. You would expect you're going to get a bigger plume of heat. What happens? Nothing. There is no plume of heat. The metabolic response is flat. And Dana Small is trying to figure out what on earth is going on. And then it hits her. It's the number 75, because the drinks were created to taste as though they had 75 calories. And the drink that actually had 75 calories is the one that got metabolized properly and the one that got the biggest brain response. This tells us how important the faculty of taste is. This is like operating instructions. Food is literally telling your brain, this is how many calories I've got, and the brain uses that to metabolize it. When it gets this mismatch happening, going, I thought I was getting X, but then it got into the stomach and it turns out it was not X, the whole thing comes to like a screeching halt. It's like the brain doesn't know what to do. She did more experiments. She found that this actually screws up the amount of insulin that gets secreted. Insulin is how the brain starts to metabolize carbohydrates, leads to insulin resistance, which is a hallmark of diabetes and metabolic disease. She does this with adolescents, and they actually have to stop the experiment because very early on, 2 of them became pre-diabetic. This is not good. So this is telling us when we monkey around with taste, bad things happen. This is telling us that this whole idea that the way food tastes is somehow disconnected from this important science of nutrition is totally wrong. It's so essential and important to it. And then we have to think twice about monkeying around with taste. And we can use that to ask a deeper question, because I talked about how intelligent the brain is. When we taste food, we might enjoy it. We might think like that tastes like chicken, that tastes like pizza, but the brain is using that as measurement to say, what am I getting? The brain also does a second round of measurement when food gets into the stomach. This is called post-ingestive. This is how we learn to like new foods. You might taste something for the first time, you're like, I don't know if I like that, but then you come to like it over time because your brain recognizes that was a good source of nutrition. There was calories, there was protein, there was vitamins. So it does the second round of analysis. Well, what happens to this brain that loves to measure when it finds out that the first round of measurement doesn't match up to the second round? There's a term for this in psychology. It's called reward prediction error. And what that means, like it sounds like, the predicted reward didn't arrive. Another simpler term for it is just called uncertainty. How does the human brain respond to uncertainty? It's like animal brains respond. It's like there's a great body of literature on this. It responds with more motivation. When a prospect, when something out there in the world becomes uncertain, we get hyped up. We want it. We expend more energy to get it. And there's a really good reason for this, because in our evolutionary past, when something important like a food or anything became uncertain, that whispers the prospect of a loss, that you might not get this. And our ancestors who lost were less likely to reproduce. So this tendency, this behavior became baked into us. And it's something that you feel. This uncertainty doesn't cause like an existential brooding. This just gets us hyped up. This is why we gamble. If I say, like, let's bet on the basketball game tonight, $10, it's not going to make either of us richer or poorer, but it's fun, right? Because we don't know who's going to win. And that game becomes more fun when it's two good teams. If it's like a really good team versus a really bad team, nobody wants to bet on this. Nobody wants to watch me, play one-on-one with an NBA player. That's boring. But the closer the odds, the more amped up we get. Another good way to think about it is the gas gauge on your car. If I told you that gas gauge was unreliable, like, it might say full, it could be empty, it could be a quarter tank, you have no idea. What are you going to do? You're going to fill up the car. You're like, I don't want to run out of gas, right? You're probably going to become like a little bit like jittery, like I got to, like, because you're just like, geez, it would really suck to run out of gas. This is what uncertainty does to us. So we create uncertainty when we mess around with the sensory qualities of food. And this is what Dana Small's studies show is the impact that this can have. But it's just the tip of the iceberg, because there are so many ways we alter the sensed qualities of food. Artificial sweeteners are just one thing. We've become paranoid about so many things in food, about caramel color, GMOs, preservatives, so many things that people get worried about. Fat replacers are a multi-billion-dollar industry. They've been with us since the 1980s, and they've flown totally under the radar. Fat replacers, very simply, are like the artificial fats, like artificial sweeteners. They evoke this rich, creamy, mouth-filling sensation of fat. They evoke the sensation of fat calories in the mouth, and they deliver far fewer calories. If your brain's a moron, this is a great idea. Fool that idiot, make it think it's getting fat, give it a few calories. If it turns out your brain's smart and it's constantly measuring, it's not going to have that effect. What's so interesting about fat replacers is you will not see them on the ingredient panel, because they've come up with all sorts of ingredient ways to essentially disguise them. So one of the first ones was developed in the 1970s. A scientist, he tried to turn whey. Whey is what's left over when you make cheese. You get the curd that turns into the cheese. You got this liquid left over. That's called whey. He wanted to turn whey into a gel just to see what happened. And he got this kind of styrofoam-like substance that crumbled, but it had like this cream cheese or cheesecake quality. That got sold to a big food company and was marketed as a fat replacer called Simpless. What it was technically was a microparticulated protein, tiny, tiny little balls of protein that were sort of tickling the touch receptors inside your mouth that made your brain think like, wow, I'm tasting fat. But you weren't getting fat, you're getting a little dribble of protein. Very interestingly, you do not see the word Simpless on an ingredient panel. You don't see microparticulated protein. You see something like milk protein or whey protein, which sounds, that sounds to me like it came from a farm. It sounds sort of natural. There's a fat replacer called Cream Fiber 7000. This is a fat replacer designed for muffins. You will not see that on the ingredient panel. It is celebrated for its, quote, clean label. What do you see on the ingredient panel? Citrus fiber. That to me sounds like it's like going to like cleanse my large intestine or something, right?
That's shocking.
I know. And this is happening all over the place. When you see things like locust bean gum, carrageenan, all these things are additives that manipulate the sensed qualities in food. There's even things we do to food that alter, cause this, what Dana Small calls nutritive mismatch, when the companies aren't even trying to do that. But we use things like modified starches. We created these decades ago. You'll take something like potato starch or cornstarch and just make it a pure starch, so you don't really taste the potato-ness of the corn. And we use these in things like a frozen meal or frozen pizza. When we microwave that, we don't want like a disgusting pool to form. We put emulsifiers in things like salad dressings or chocolate milk because we don't want them to separate, because that would be gross. These all affect how food tastes. And this is, again, confusing the brain. So there's so much that we've done to create this divide between how food tastes and what's arriving in the body. This, to me, is the big change. And when we look at the psychology, this creates uncertainty, reward prediction error. Brain doesn't know what it's getting. What does it cause? It causes elevated motivation. It causes craving. What do we see in the brain scans? We see craving.
Wow, fascinating. It makes me wonder what is happening in the brain when somebody consumes one of these fake meat products. Because we've co-evolved with animal products, right?
Yes,
and
we
so
have.
in the brain of somebody who's ingesting one of these products that's increasingly becoming increasingly more meat-like in terms of their texture and taste. I mean, in my view, not a one-to-one replacement, but some of them taste not bad. And the brain begins expecting this flood of nutrients, right? Like the most pristine quality protein to be found in nature, highly bioavailable micronutrients like zinc, vitamin B12, creatine, what have you. And then you get this ultra processed equivalent of human pet food coming down the pike.
Yeah, well, and not only that, they say it's plant-based, but it has none of the qualities of plant food, the phytonutrients, the fiber, that's all gone, right? So it's like, I mean, it's plant-based the way like Coca-Cola is technically plant-based, right? The sugar came from a plant, the flavor is supposed to be like nutmeg and citrus. So that to me is such an interesting point because like, not only is it worrisome that's happening, what I find so interesting is that these products, like when they're announced, they get like a standing ovation. Everyone's like, we've done it. This is amazing. I'm like, it was also the same with, remember when Soylent came out and people were like, oh, there's this like precision nutrition solution. Finally, it's like, wow, like some Silicon Valley entrepreneur does a better job of attending to your body's needs than food, which is what we evolved to eat. What's also interesting is that the verbiage they use in the branding, impossible foods, beyond meat, as though we've broken the bounds of nature and are now soaring into this new universe of like nutritional perfection. These foods are designed from the ground up to fool your brain. I think some of their intentions aren't totally wrong, but it's just such a total misreading of the relationship between the brain and the food that we eat. And there's just this incredible level of hubris. I talk, as you can tell, I'm somewhat obsessed with Italy and because I find it so interesting and so exciting that you can eat such great food. And I was trying to figure out, like, what is it? Like, where did we go wrong and why did they go right? And what's really interesting is if you look at Northern Italy, there was a time when it was actually very similar to a part of North America. If you go back over a century ago, it was a lot like the Southern US, which seems kind of weird, but both, just like the present day, there was an epidemic raging. It was an epidemic of a disease called Pellagra, which means rough skin in this old dialect of Italian. And that's how it would start. It would start with like these skin scales that would then start to spread. The victims would get like diarrhea, dementia. They would eventually die. And nobody knew the cause. Just like with obesity, there's all these experts that, they said it's caused by mosquitoes. Some would say it's caused by humidity. Some would say it's caused by spores that get into your blood. Nobody had any clue. It shows up in Atlanta in 1901. It starts to spread. It's this epidemic. We finally realized, thanks to an epidemiologist named Goldberger, that it actually had to do with food. And this led to our understanding of micronutrition. It turns out that pellagra is caused by a deficiency of niacin, or vitamin B3. What becomes so interesting is when you look at how the two different cultures responded. In North America, we did what on the surface seems like the sensible thing to do. We said, well, if niacin is essential and people need it, let's just give it to them. So we passed these laws in the early 1940s. We started to put niacin, thiamine, and riboflavin, and also iron. First it was bread, and then it just gets into all the processed carbs. It's in breakfast cereals, it's in donuts, it's in anything you can think of. And now we're putting them in energy drinks. They're in everything. It worked really, really well. Pellagra was like wiped out practically overnight. What is so interesting is you look over at Italy, and what did they do? Well, they had access to the science, but oddly enough, Southerners were eating grits, Italians were eating too much polenta. They didn't put niacin in the polenta. They came up with these, they would say things like, we should have communal bread ovens. They suggested that poor people raise rabbits because if you want to raise meats, like rabbits are a cheap and easy way to raise meat. They would say things like people with pellagra should drink wine, which is like hilarious and ridiculous, but actually not that ridiculous because the wines back then weren't well filtered. They had a lot of yeast in them, and people didn't know this. Yeast has a lot of niacin in it. So someone had pellagra back then, drinking a glass of wine was actually pretty good advice. Wow. Here's what's interesting. You look at Italy. Did their solution work? Yes. Did it work as well? Not really. It took longer, but they literally ate their way out of a nutritional epidemic. You fast forward the clock a century, and the American South is still a nutritional disaster. What was formerly the pellagra belt is now the obesity belt, the diabetes belt that has the highest rates of diabetes, obesity, metabolic disease in North America. Northern Italy is this Alice in Wonderland fairy tale land of insanely good food. matched to trim bodies. What is really interesting, there's a connection with vitamins that we could talk about, but just on a more general level, what's so interesting is that here we thought, in our kind of hubris, we thought something's wrong with food. Food is by its nature incomplete, and something's wrong with us. We don't know what's good for us. So we're going to intervene and we're going to change food. In Italy, they saw it completely differently. They said, food is not the cause. The cause of pellagra is quite clearly poverty. The cure is food. So we started beating up on food and denying it and thinking there's something wrong with it. They celebrated it. I had this epiphany when I was in Italy. I went to this bean festival. I told you about that place that loves beans. And I made the mistake of asking a local, how should I prepare beans? Because he starts to tell me. And then all these other locals start flocking and saying, no, you don't do that. No, you got to add rosemary. No, don't add rosemary, add an onion. And I'm like, it doesn't matter where I go. Everybody argues about food. But then I realized the arguments in North America, we have these like these hilarious arguments about nutrients, talking about fat and carbs and protein. None of us have any idea what we're talking about. The physiologists who study this professionally can't predict how many calories they're going to go through in a day. They're subjects. And we carry on like we all have PhDs arguing about ketosis and all this stuff. In Italy, they argue about recipes. What is the best way to enjoy this food? Their relationship with food is so different. We think food is a problem that must be vanquished. They think food is like this ongoing cure that replenishes and gives us joy and nourishes us. And it's less steeped in science, but boy, it's a way better way to live. And it's clearly way more effective.
Well, I'm with you. I mean, I definitely have over the years become less interested in the debate between, low carb, low fat. I think the science has also evolved and gotten to a point where, we're now realizing that, after you control for protein and calories, your carbohydrate to fat ratio, macronutrient ratio doesn't really matter that much, provided you're consuming whole foods, which is the key sort of leverage point for, I think, micronutrient repletion and satiety and all that stuff. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. But still a lot of people struggle with cravings. How do you know when to give into a craving and when to push back against the craving? Like a lot of people, deciding whether or not to go to the kitchen and give in to that feeling that we all know too well, especially over the past 2 years. We're spending a lot more time in close proximity to food, and especially foods that are emotionally very comforting, right? So how do we know when to give into a craving? How do we know when to push back?
Well, it's a really good question. I think one thing you can do is ask yourself, what is the relationship that I have with that food? When I crave it, when I start to eat it, does it actually satisfy me, or does it get me into that kind of eternal recurring thing of just like one bite just makes me want to eat another bite. I visited a clinic in Germany, really interesting clinic, a scientist named Anja Hilbert, and she treats eating disorders, disordered eating. She's one of she treats one of some of Germany's most difficult cases, and she developed something called hedonic therapy. Hedonic is a fancy scientific word just meaning pleasure, and she talked about these two neural circuits and how important they are. And she brought me through some of the therapy, which really exposes the experiential quality of both of them. So the first thing we did was about this wanting, this craving circuit. And she gave me a bag of potato chips, cheese and onion flavored. And she's like, look at the bag, look at the picture. She then had me open the bag. She's like, listen to the pop it made, and then inhale the aroma. And then she's like, take 2 potato chips, one in each hand. She's like, you can just nibble them, but you can't eat them. You can smell them. And then she said, rub them together. And I thought, this is just so silly, but I rubbed them together, and I was totally gripped by this desire to eat these chips. Like it was like a fierce storm. Like I wanted to eat them so badly. And then she's like, throw them in the garbage. I was like, are you insane? But I did that. And then I take 2 new, more pristine, even better looking chips. I mean, they're like a brand new car. They just look perfect and incredible. And this just fever of craving just increases and increases. And it made me realize the power that certain foods, I don't have a problem with eating, but it gives you just an insight into how some of these foods work. And they kind of whisper that there's this pleasure that never truly gets delivered, because you put it in your mouth and the pleasure is actually just the desire to get the next one, but it doesn't really nourish and satisfy you. Well, then she said, throw those out And then she gives me this little square of dark chocolate covering this biscuit core. And she said, put that in your mouth and let the heat of your body melt it. And boy, what a different food experience that was. That was like a journey. Like all of a sudden I was the passenger. Instead of being kind of amped up and everything speeding up and being on edge and, tense, everything relaxes. Time slows down. And I'm just sitting there experiencing this chocolate. And what was so amazing is that, yes, there's calories in chocolate, but this tiny chocolate gave me such an incredible amount of pleasure. Here's what gets really interesting. She uses this as a therapy. She has patients with binge eating disorder that literally get volcanic cravings to stuff themselves with calories. And she'll say at these times, just take a very, very fine chocolate, a really good one, like not a cheap one, and enjoy it in this way. And she finds that the pleasure of these foods can extinguish that volcano of craving. And I talked to some of her patients, and they talked about how their relationship with food changed. That one of them, her name was Mary. She found that the food that really helped her was dark chocolate, because she said you can't binge eat dark chocolate. Like you just have to sit there and enjoy it. Like it tells its story and it's going to make you wait. You can't shove it in your mouth. And this changed her palate. She talked about how like one of the foods she really learned to love was rutabaga. She loved eating natural yogurt with fruit because she loved how the sour tang of the yogurt would then be quenched by this burst of sweetness when she would crunch into some of the fruit. So her palate changed. She said, yeah, she still gets the old cravings, especially like she had to move that week. And she's saying moving was really stressful and she could feel some of the old cravings. But she said she knows that cake, like she loves cake, but she says, cake, it just whispers these lies to me. It never really satisfies me. So I think if we can start to understand how food operates on this deeper mental level, that can help find a way out. Like it's important to realize that foods that really truly give you pleasure can be used to fight these foods, and also to figure out what foods are really the dangerous ones that bring us to that bad place.
It is remarkable. When I eat a piece of a 85% dark chocolate bar, I get this incredible dopamine hit. Like it's very pleasurable for me, but I'm good after just a square. Whereas if I open up a 70 or 72% bar, which 72, that still qualifies as being dark chocolate, right? It'll say on the label dark chocolate, but it takes real mental muscle for me not to want to eat the whole bar.
Yeah, it's amazing how different it is. And also, which one, in your ratings of chocolate, which one do you like better?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think that they're both equally delicious, honestly. Right. I think that there's the one that has a lower cacao percentage has more sugar and it tastes a little bit more like indulgent, but I wouldn't say that I like it any less than the 85%.
Right.
version.
So it's interesting that that you can sort of tune into like foods that are more satisfying can still be just as delicious.
Yeah.
So I think that's telling us something important. And this isn't just a simple game of calorie counting, right? This is coming at it a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. This is so interesting. Have you ever seen a homunculus man, like a human drawn out and It's called a homunculus, where it's basically like a little human, but with features drawn to represent proportionally the amount of sensory priority that a given feature is allowed in the cortex. So, for example, if you go to Google Images and you search for homunculus cat, you'll see a cat has a little tiny body and the head is huge, because cats perceive and interact with the world in many ways through their heads. That's why their ears, their whiskers, they're always rubbing their face up on things, their sense of smell. If you look at a human's, it's got a tiny body, massive hands, right? So our hands are one of the major ways that we perceive the world and interact with the world and draw information about our environment through our hands, right? But it's also, we have our noses, so like huge nose, huge tongue, huge genitalia.
Right.
It's really interesting to look at, and it rings true. If you have a body, you can look at something like that and you can be like, wow, I kind of relate to that depiction. And it kind of reflects what you were talking about earlier. The fact that our senses, our sense of smell, our brain has, or you were saying that our senses, our sense of smell, our elementary canal is given all this priority in terms of like development.
Right. But it's so interesting how we never talk about that. I wonder the degree to which we can ever measure these things scientifically. I talk to scientists. Lots of my friends are scientists, and there's all sorts of scientific studies about pizza But you start to look at them, you're like, okay, you guys did this in a lab on a university campus. Like, what pizza were you using? Often it's things like microwave pizza or delivered pizza. And I say things like, what about Neapolitan pizza? I mean, Neapolitan pizza to me is really interesting. Not very thick crust. They don't like overload it with cheese. They don't stuff cheese into the crust. There's often like, basil leaf on it or mushrooms. It's not like this calorie bomb, like deep dish or, the stuff we eat, the stuff you see advertised on TV. How do you test that in the lab? Because you'd actually need to have like a wood-fired oven, the pizzaiolo in the lab. That's just not going to happen. But they often say things like, well, the reason you like that is because you're on vacation in Italy and you had a glass of wine and the sun was setting and you weren't working. I'm like, I'm not denying that. But Neapolitan pizza is a totally different kind of pizza than a microwave pizza. How do you measure those subtle qualities that to people who love food are so important, but to so many people who study it, it's just like pizza is just like fat, carbs, and protein. It's so much more than that. And I think we have to understand evolution designed us to be eaters, not to be nutritionists. And you have to approach food on that level.
I agree. Well, you mentioned that all diets work, but for a period of around 6 months. So what are some of the, key take homes? You've been around the world, you've interviewed all these experts, you've cited all these incredible studies. What are the key take homes for people that are struggling day to day with craving?
I would say, first of all, it takes a while to screw up your brain. So I think it's going to take a while to unscrew it up. So I don't think, these miracle results, it's like the diet thing. Yeah, they're true just for about 6 months. I would say treat your brain the way it ought to be treated. So stop looking for these things that fool your brain. Be suspicious of foods that say things like diet or light. Stay away from artificial sweeteners. I would say eat like an Italian. So one of the things I say is like eat real food. That's not exactly new. So many people who write books like this come up with this like eat real food, don't eat junk food. But I would add this, and I think this is important. Eat as an Italian does, which is to say every meal should be an opportunity for maximal enjoyment. Revere the products of the land and the sea and enjoy them. Make that experience of eating food. That's your brain gaining information. That's a really important moment. Food is really awesome. It gives us pleasure like 3 times a day. This is a wonderful thing. So I would say do those 2 things. And I think try to restore the relationship with food as it is meant to be eaten.
I love that. When it comes to artificial sweeteners, you touched on some of those really interesting studies, but are you convinced based on the science and your research that they are a dietary evil, or do you think that they can be enjoyed in moderation, especially for the dieting person who, maybe the daily Diet Coke is that's their vice. There are certainly worse vices to have, I would imagine.
Well, the science is unclear a lot. So a lot of the RCTs and artificial sweeteners, that's when they do a study, like they have like a placebo. Well, it's hard to have a placebo, but they give them to a group and monitor to see what happens. They look at the very best, they look like they make you lose a tiny amount of weight, like really insignificant. Then you look at the observational data and they look at a population of humans. It's like, wow, people who consume artificial sweeteners, like really high risk of obesity, really high risk of metabolic disease. Is it reverse causation? Are they consuming artificial sweeteners because they're obese? This is where it gets tricky. The only thing I'd say is I think people have been doing these studies looking for a physiological response. And what I talk about is a psychological response. And that I think you'd have to test differently. I would say this, though. I think that experience of drinking that Diet Coke, it's still a really weird, fake, confected flavor experience. And ultimately, I don't think that is the path to salvation. I guess you could create a world where you completely uncouple calories from sweetness, but at that point, I think sweet foods would just lose their luster. But I would also say that I think that research shows us not so much about sweeteners, but when you start to alter these things, when you start to alter the sensed qualities in food. So it's not just sweeteners, it's also fat replacers, it's also flavorings. The other thing I think is interesting is this whole idea of uncertainty. Another way we see it playing out is in socioeconomic status. People, poverty is a good predictor of obesity. On the surface, you're like, why would people who don't have enough money eat too much food? Because A, they're spending money they don't have on more food than they need. B, it's causing them like diseases and so forth. But the reason is because this is a case of uncertainty. If you have reason to be concerned about where your next meal is going to come from, unconsciously, that's going to make you more motivated to eat. So one of the things I think would be interesting to do research on is, do these different kinds of uncertainty team up on one another? So you can create uncertainty by, let's say, using artificial sweeteners. Maybe for somebody who's doing just fine, leading a stable life, and their diet isn't in other respects good, that isn't such a big deal. But let's say that you put that sensory disruption into the brain of an adolescent girl who's starting a new school, whose parents are getting divorced. And then you've got all sorts of other areas in their life of uncertainty. And you wonder, can these all kind of coalesce and have an exaggerated influence? And that's the kind of thing that is more difficult to test in a lab. But I think if we understand it for its psychological components, rather than just its physiological, like does it have energy or not, maybe we can start to ask better questions.
Interesting. It's a great perspective, and leaves room for science to come in and to investigate. I appreciate that. I mean, in full disclosure, I personally avoid artificial sweeteners, although I definitely make use of stevia, monk fruit, the more naturalistic, non-caloric sweeteners, also sugar alcohols and things like that. Not because, I've seen that there's this huge overwhelming body of research to say that those are safe and the artificial ones aren't, but I tend to abide by the precautionary principle. I think that I personally, the fact that stevia comes from a ground leaf, to me, that's a little bit more.
It's more comforting than something that came from a patented DuPont or something like that.
Exactly. Well said. Well said. Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one. What happens if you stop eating sugar for 30 days?
Yeah, let's do it.
One of the major problems with the standard American diet is that sugar is insidious, that it's just everywhere. Mm-hmm. And manufacturers will use various types of sugar. They'll use cane sugar, they'll use coconut sugar, they'll use high fructose corn syrup, they'll use dextrose, they'll use date sugar. No matter what kind of sugar, essentially, functionally speaking, from biological standpoint, sugar is sugar. Certain sugars will cleave and become a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule, as I mentioned. Certain sugars are primarily fructose, like agave syrup, for example, is 70 to 80% fructose. But with the exception of overfeeding, most sugars generally have the same effect, with the exception of fructose. But the problem I think that most people will highlight with regard to fructose consumption is really the overconsumption of fructose that drives a lot of the problems that are associated with it. And fructose is primarily a fruit sugar, so it's found naturally in all whole fruits to varying quantities. Whole fruits generally contain glucose, fructose in some combination. They also contain sugar alcohols and other sugars. So it's basically like a sugar soup when you eat a whole fruit. But under isocaloric, eucaloric conditions, or eucaloric, I should say, conditions where we're not overfeeding, there really isn't a major consequence that I know of to consuming fructose, especially when fructose is contained in whole foods. The problem, as I mentioned, with sugar is that it's now added to innumerable ultra-processed food products to the degree that your average American now is consuming 77 grams of added sugar every single day, which, if you do the math, that's about 20 teaspoons of pure sugar that your average American is ingesting every day. And this is added sugar. So we have no biological requirement for added sugar. This is just the sugar that manufacturers are adding to packaged processed foods. So it's about 20 grams of, 20 teaspoons of pure sugar, which I think is really important for people to visualize. And if you net that out in terms of calories, that's just over 300 calories a day of extra sugar that people are consuming. It takes about 500 extra calories a day to add up to a pound of fat gain over the span of a week. I think a lot of people think that sugar drives weight gain. It's important to be clear up front that eating too many calories really drives weight gain. Whether those calories come from sugar or fat, it doesn't really make much of a difference. But the problem with added sugar is that it provides no satiety effect. So it doesn't fill you up. It doesn't slow digestion. We never tire of eating it. And it's empty calories that provides no nutritional benefit. There are no nutrients found in added sugar. We can talk about certain phytochemicals that might be found in sweeteners like maple syrup or honey. But again, for the most part, sugar is sugar.
Okay, so because at the beginning you mentioned that like sugar is a nutrient, but added sugar is not a
Correct.
nutrient.
Yeah, it can be tricky to try to wrap your head around this. We don't have any need for dietary sugar. So you don't need to consume any sugar or carbohydrates for that matter to survive. We have a daily requirement for protein and we have a daily requirement for certain fats, but there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate, and sugar is a carbohydrate.
Okay.
Um, when I say that it's essential, I mean that it's essential from the standpoint of the brain, but your body is a very elegant and highly adaptable chemistry set that can create sugar from the barest of ingredients. So we can create sugar from fat. We can. This occurs when triglycerides are liberated from adipocytes or our fat cells. Triglycerides are three fatty acids bound to a glycerol molecule, and that glycerol molecule is a carbohydrate. So we can create carbohydrates from fat. We can also create carbohydrates from, and specifically sugar. We can also create sugar from protein in a process called gluconeogenesis in the liver. So whenever we cease to eat sugar, the body, in particular, specifically the liver, has us covered, in the sense that it can create sugar to pick up the slack to continue to fuel our brains. 60% of our brain's energy needs can come from fat, but there is about a 40% energy requirement for sugar that the brain has.
Okay.
So from a dietary standpoint, it's not essential. From a physiologic standpoint, it is essential.
Okay.
Um,
That's helpful.
yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So protein, essential. Fats, essential. No such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Now, people can obviously survive without carbohydrates, but there is a question of whether or not the inclusion of carbohydrates, and carbs are the term. When I use the term carbohydrates really are a category of nutrients that include fiber, that include complex carbohydrates, and that include simple sugars.
Mm-hmm.
People who perform exercise regularly, which is very important, do better with carbohydrates in the diet, because carbohydrates provide a source of energy for our muscle cells. Our muscle cells store glucose specifically in the form of glycogen, and glycogen is really important to have in your muscle tissue in order to perform high intensity anaerobic work.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the reasons why people who are on ketogenic diets, they see a decrement in terms of their performance. They don't perform as well, especially high intensity explosive moves that are much easier for people who are carb loaded.
Mm-hmm.
Also, insulin is an important hormone in the body for anabolic signaling. So for anybody who's really especially in a growth phase, trying to pack on muscle, there's really no good reason to avoid carbohydrates. And in fact, the inclusion of carbohydrates in the diet are optimal. And we see that from bodybuilders. We see that from people who are professional athletes. Carbohydrates are crucially important. When you take those out, performance tends to bonk. There is a rationale to excluding carbohydrates from one's diet if one wants to be on a ketogenic diet. But I think it's important to do that with all of the knowledge that these diets are generally they are really great for serving a specific therapeutic purpose, for neurological issues, as an example. But they're generally hard to adhere to, and I don't think that chronically being in ketosis makes any more sense from an evolutionary standpoint as being chronically out of ketosis. So, but that's like a sort of side conversation.
Yeah.
The point is that people today overconsume sugar. It's just everywhere. It's in commercial bread products. It's in yogurts. It's in nut milks. It's in sauces. Ketchup is a major source of sugar. We put it in our coffees. We consume sugar sweetened beverages. It's just everywhere. I can't think of a single modern food product that doesn't have some degree of sugar in it. The other day I was at the supermarket and I tried to buy some shredded coconut, and it was sweetened with sugar. Roasted nuts often have sugar added to it. Even salt, iodized salt, has sugar added to it as a means of stabilizing the iodine that they add to iodized salt.
Really?
Yeah, dextrose. So
Okay, that leads me to my next question because when I'm looking at these labels in the grocery store, it's not going to say in big red letters, this has got sugar in it. So, what are some sneaky ways that, like, when we're checking our processed foods to look for sugar in it? Like dextrose, I don't know if I necessarily would have known that that was sugar before we had this conversation.
yeah, generally, any word that has the suffix "ose" is going to be a sugar.
Sugar.
Yeah, so
Okay,
dextrose, glucose, sucrose, fructose. Yeah, those are all sugars.
cool.
And but that being said, also lactose is another example, the dairy sugar. But manufacturers love to hide sugars under bougie sounding names.
Hmm.
So you won't necessarily see glucose or sucrose, but you'll see organic cane sugar or coconut sugar or brown rice syrup. I mean, these are basically just it's a facade to hide the fact that this is added sugar, essentially. And now, thankfully, as of the past, I believe 5 or so years, now manufacturers do have to identify how much added sugar is in a given product.
Yeah.
So if you look on the nutrition facts label, this is very important. You want to make sure that the added sugar is as close to zero as possible. Now, if you are looking through the ingredients list, which I think this is a very good habit for people to get into, and you do see that there's some that they do list refined cane sugar, for example,
Hmm.
as an ingredient, but then you look and it has 0 grams of added sugar in a serving, then what that implies is that there's really a negligible amount of sugar in that product.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's still better to not consume products with added sugar. I mean, that's the best habit to set for yourself.
Okay.
But if you are going to consume a product, it's helpful to know that you can see the exact gram quantity of added sugar now on the nutrition facts label.
Super helpful.
And the closer you can get to 0, the better. Also keeping in mind that how many serving sizes are in a package, and being mindful of how many servings you intend on consuming. That's all. That's also going to be very helpful.
Okay. So looking at nutrition labels for sneaky ways.
Yeah.
So that also, like, we talked about how sugar is sugar, but then a lot of these like bougie new health brands are coming out with like coconut sugar that are like deeming themselves healthier than cane sugar.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? Is coconut sugar better than regular sugar?
It's a good question. It's all at the end of the day marketing. Sugar is sugar. Now, certain sugars like agave syrup. Agave syrup is worth highlighting because it's one of the worst offenders in the sense that it really does masquerade as a health food, as a healthier and even diabetic friendly sugar.
Hmm.
And this is because it's primarily fructose. And so it'll promote the fact, usually on the label, that it has that products using agave syrup instead of cane sugar have a lower glycemic index. They have a lower glycemic impact. And that's true, but that's only because it's so low in glucose. And the glycemic index of a product is a measure, it's a metric that measures how rapidly a food is going to elevate your blood sugar, which is really your blood glucose. So a sugar with no glucose in it isn't going to elevate your blood glucose because glucose is the only sugar that can elevate blood glucose. Fructose doesn't elevate blood glucose. Instead, it goes straight to the liver, where the liver stores it, or it gets converted to fat. So that's why manufacturers that use agave syrup will claim that, which is true, which is accurate, that that agave syrup has a low glycemic index because it's mostly fructose. And this is a problem because most people overconsume carbohydrates. Your average American today consumes about 300 grams of carbohydrates total over the course of the day, which includes the 77 grams of added sugar that they're consuming on a daily basis. And they're sedentary. And the liver has a storage capacity only of about 100 grams of carbohydrates. And this differs person to person based on body size, et cetera. But for the most part, people are walking around in a fed state all day, consuming 300 grams of carbohydrates, not being all that active. We know that leisure time physical activity is at an all-time low. And so in that milieu, is it actually healthier to eat, to consume a sweetener that is mostly fructose? No, because again, it goes straight to the liver. Most of our livers are already full.
Mhm.
They're replete with glycogen. And so what ends up happening is it then stimulates the liver to create fat from that excess of fructose.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so that can help drive up triglycerides, which is not good, puts people at increased risk for cardiovascular disease. It can contribute to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a major problem here in the United States and increasingly abroad. So it's a big problem. And this is one of the reasons why, as I mentioned, fructose has a low glycemic index. Sucrose, which is table sugar, is about 50% glucose and 50% fructose.
Mm.
The glycemic index of table sugar is somewhere in the middle because, again, it's half fructose, right? And then you have glucose, which has a glycemic index of 100 because it's pure glucose.
Right.
So you consume glucose, it spikes your blood sugar because it just goes straight into the blood.
Okay, so that table sugar is really not so great because it's got two kinds of bad.
Well,
not bad, but
yeah, it's
affecting your liver and your blood glucose.
Yeah.
Like it's doing both.
Here's the deal. If you're not over consuming calories and you live an active lifestyle, then you can have some sugar in your diet and you'll be okay, right? So everybody has a different life, right? Everybody has a different fitness level. Everybody has a different diet. But statistically, most people in the United States are overweight. By the year 2030, 1 in 2 people are going to be not just overweight, but obese in the United States. 50% of people have either type 2 diabetes or prediabetes here in the United States, and prediabetes is often underdiagnosed. And what precedes prediabetes, sometimes by decades, is hyperinsulinemia. So people are eating lots and lots of carbohydrates, and they see their insulin levels chronically elevated. It's like a blood sugar roller coaster all throughout the day. For that person, which again is most people, they really have no business consuming any sugar, right? Because most Americans are deficient in at least one essential nutrient. About 90% of Americans are deficient in at least one essential nutrient. And so many of us are struggling with problems with our weight and other components of metabolic syndrome, right? 9 in 10 adults now have some component of metabolic syndrome, which is essentially metabolic illness. And so for that person, added sugar, they really should be diligent about looking at the foods that they're eating, making sure that they are not consuming, or they're at least minimizing their consumption of added sugar. Now, if you live a fit lifestyle and if you are mindful about the foods that you eat, you're not overweight, you don't have your waist size is normal and healthy, you don't carry a lot of visceral fat. Is there room in your diet for added sugar? Yeah, probably. And for that person, it doesn't matter so much where the sugar comes from because their livers are always they're chronically in a state of being glycogen depleted and then being filled up with whatever fructose they consume, right? And if they're active, whatever glucose they consume is going to glycogenate their muscles, right? Which we discussed is important for energy production.
Okay. That's helpful. So we've got added sugar. We've got like the table sugar, like the classic sugar in a cookie. Where else, like you mentioned lactose. And then I do want to go back to talk about fruit a little bit and like fructose and how fruit is kind of a combination of different sugars. But where else are we finding sugar in our diet if it's not in like our pre-packaged foods or cookies and cakes?
Yeah. Well, those are the most common occurrences of sugar. And it's also worth noting, I should add that whether or not sugar fits into your personal calorie budget, there are some other problems associated with sugar consumption, especially when we consume a lot of it in one sitting. So there have been studies that have shown that one single high sugar bolus, usually they'll give patients 75 grams of glucose, which is what they'll use in an oral glucose tolerance test. So they use these 75 gram boluses of glucose. for these tests. And they find that in one study that just one high sugar beverage was enough to elevate subjects' blood pressure for 2 hours after sugar ingestion. So that was really interesting. We know that having healthy blood pressure is crucially important for cardiovascular health, for brain health. Now, this was all at one time that the sugar was given. We know that sugar, when you drink a lot of it, it stimulates your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response, which is one of the potential mechanisms whereby we saw in this study an increase in blood pressure. I'm not sure if there's a threshold effect or if that sort of consistent consumption of 77 grams of sugar throughout the day is going to have the same net effect on one's blood pressure. But we do know that high sugar diets that are rich in added sugars is associated with hypertension, which is high blood pressure, which is not good for your brain health. It's not good for your cardiovascular health. So we know that, independent of calorie intake, that sugar can have an acute effect on your blood pressure.
So sugar is not only raising your blood glucose levels, affecting your liver, it's also increasing your blood pressure, which I feel like is something not talked about. So is there anything else that consuming large amounts of sugar is causing a problem on that is not just like, oh, my blood sugar is increased, that we don't know about or talk about that often?
Yeah, it can lead to a sharp drop in testosterone. So there was another study that found that a similar bolus of sugar, and I believe it used both pure glucose and sucrose, which is, sucrose is actually more representative of the kind of sugar that we consume on a daily basis. Even high fructose corn syrup molecularly looks a lot like sucrose. Both are about 50% glucose, 50% fructose.
Okay.
So in this study, they found, and we can put in the show notes citations just in case people want to read the studies. Found that subjects after a high sugar bolus had a 25% drop in their testosterone, which sustained again for 2 hours afterwards. So
wow,
testosterone is really important for well-being. It's super important for body composition. It's important for libido, for sexual performance. It's important for so many things for both men and women. I mean, women also have testosterone, about a tenth as much as men, but crucially important to know. Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Here's what happens when you experience awe. It leads to what we call shrinking of the self. You feel smaller when you're in the presence of something vast and indescribable. And when you feel smaller, so does your chatter. So experiencing awe, it's like the ultimate perspective broadener.